Greens are threatening to block Labor's Help to Buy housing scheme unless there are significant changes to negative gearing. Speaking on Sky News, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers said the government had no plans to change negative gearing, but the Greens are set to use their power in the Senate to pressure Labor to reduce negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts in exchange for their support. Well, joining me live now is Greens MP Max Chandler-Mather. Max, thanks so much for your time. First of all, we all know that Labor said that there would be no changes to stage 3 tax cuts either. So do you think that they're wavering on negative gearing too?
Well, they should be, and we know that the Prime Minister said in his own words, when economic circumstances change, well, so should government policy. Well, we're in the worst housing crisis we've faced in generations with skyrocketing house prices and rents, and all the government are offering is a policy that will make the situation worse. 0.2% of renters will be able to access this scheme every year. For the other 99.8% of renters, this will drive up house prices. And so changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, what they'll do is free up billions of dollars in government revenue and give first home buyers who regularly get beaten out by a property investor at auctions a chance to actually buy their own home. And then we'll be able to use that extra revenue to invest in public housing the way governments used to in Australia in the 20th century. If we are going to fix the housing crisis, we have to address negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions.
OK, but not all of it can be done by government. Not all homes can be public housing. So what would changing negative gearing do to the supply in the market?
Well, actually what we know is over 90% of all property investor purchases are on existing dwellings. That means they're not actually adding to supply. What they're doing is hoarding homes that could have been used by a first home buyer. I'm sure there are a lot of parents out there who right now are worried about their kids and whether or not they'll be able to buy a home. And one of the reasons they're struggling is because the government dishes out billions of dollars in tax handouts to people with multiple properties, 10 or 20 properties. And what that does is drive up house prices and allow them to beat out renters and first home buyers at auctions. And look, in a country in Australia where we pride ourselves on providing fairness and giving everyone an opportunity, that doesn't really seem fair.
The Treasurer said there are no plans to change negative gearing. I think anyone who follows politics closely or even not so closely would know that that always leaves the door open. So what can you tell us, Max? What's happening behind the scenes? Do you have a sympathetic ear?
Well, look, we know that there are all sorts of people across the political spectrum now pointing out we do need to shift on these big tax handouts for big property investors. Everyone from Dominic Perrottet...
Hang on. Let's talk about what you just said there, big cash handouts for big property investors. Surely you acknowledge that people using this negative gearing, they're not all big investors. They're not necessarily rich as you would declare them, right?
Well, actually, if you look at the government's own documents, the vast lion's share of these tax concessions go to the top 10% of earners. Now, what the Greens policy in 2020 was phasing out these tax concessions for everyone but one investment property. So we're not going to touch the people with one investment property, but we are talking about those people with 5, 10, 20 investment properties.
Which is some. There's a few in that building, aren't there, Max? Anyone in the Greens?
There are, and... Well, that's right, but the big difference is that anyone in the Greens
got multiple negatively geared properties?
Well, yes, there are, but the big difference is they are pushing to phase out those tax concessions. The problem we have is we have a property investor, Prime Minister, who is refusing to phase out billions of dollars in tax concessions for property investors that are denying millions of renters the chance of ever buying a home. That's the big problem. And I think people in civil society are always really frustrated with the hypocrisy of politicians. Yes. And I couldn't think of a better example than the fact that the overwhelming majority or a large share of Parliament own property investments, and then you have the two major parties who have most of those property investments are refusing to tax concessions they benefit from.
Max, when you talk about hypocrisy in politics, I mean, you say the difference is that those within the Greens are pushing to have it abolished. If you really believed that negative gearing was so unfair, why wouldn't these Greens MPs or senators sell their negatively geared properties under their own volition? I mean, that's hypocrisy, isn't it?
Well, I think in the same way that I think that politicians' wages shouldn't be as high as they are, there are all sorts of policies, or for instance, that we should phase transition to renewable energy. It's obviously, I think really our job in Parliament is to push to change policy. Sometimes that doesn't mean that people on their own individual behaviour are going to be slightly different.
But that's like saying, do as I say, not as I do, right?
Well, no, what we're saying is that we have a chance in Parliament to phase out those tax concessions for property investors. And you have one group in Parliament who will vote tomorrow to phase out those tax concessions, which is the Greens. And then you have the Labor and Liberal Party who will seem to be willing to fight tooth and nail to refuse to phase out those tax concessions that will cost, by the way, overall, the federal budget over the next 10 years, $500 billion, which imagine what we could spend that on: building public housing, dental into Medicare. I think the bottom line here should be, why is it that the two major parties who have a lot of property investors are refusing to touch those tax concessions? And I think that really is the big question.